Good morning and welcome to our UBC Learning Circle, engaging with coming faces through the past, transgenerational conversations through tangible and intangible knowledges. Today's conversation is presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health and is presented, and we'd like to thank the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the UBC Learning Circle and allowing us to have these conversations. Before we formally begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect and gratitude that I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Please feel free to introduce yourselves and the nation you're calling in from in the chat box. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarain Squawkin. I am the Learning Circle Manager. I am Syilx Okanagan on my mother's side and Hickory Apache and Belgian settler on my father's side. I will be the moderator for today's discussion. Joining you, now working behind the scenes is Cynthia, our production coordinator. She will be in the background interacting with everyone in the chat. And finally, before we get into today's discussion, I will provide a gentle heads up that the topics covered may be sensitive or emotionally triggering. Please make sure that you are looking after yourself, and if at any point in time you need to talk to an elder, friend, counselor, or family member, don't hesitate to do so. We have some prompts in the chat if you need additional support. Now I'll turn it over to our guest, to introduce ourselves.
Okay. Yes. Tego Thewaguego, Talena Atfield, ni yung gats, kanyang gihaga, ni wan go and jodo, aswego ni de wagino. Yeah, my name is Talena Atfield, and I am currently an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Waterloo. Previous to that, I was a curator for 7 years at a national museum. And I'm currently holding a Canada Research Chair in Don Dewate ni Goroganyo, which means we will put our minds together. So I'm thrilled to have been invited to come and speak with everyone today about some of the work that I've been doing. Um, yeah, so I guess I'll start out just kind of by prefacing my journey into how this all came about and what led me here. And then sort of kind of an overview of what we'll go through. So I grew up in London, Ontario, which is about an hour and 15 minutes from Six Nations, which is my home community. I'm mixed settler on my mother's side and in Mohawk on my father's side. And my father is Dan Atfield. He is Turtle Clan from Six Nations, and his mother, or my grandmother, is of the Miracle and Tripp families, Turtle Clan from Six Nations. And my dad's father, or my grandfather, is of the Curley and Atfield families, and he is Wolf Clan, Six Nations. So for Haudenosaunee people, we trace our descendancy through our mothers. So I don't currently have a clan, but when I do attend Longhouse, I sit with wolves and bears. So yeah, this came about. I always knew growing up that I was Mohawk, but I didn't know what that meant because I grew up fairly disconnected. I didn't know my grandparents. They moved to Calgary when I was one. So I didn't really ever get a chance to speak with them. I was close with my dad's sister, but none of his other siblings. And I did spend time on Six Nations visiting with my dad when he was employed at Six Nations Polytechnic and when he went to visit family and for funerals. And yeah, one of my favorite memories is stopping by to see my grandmother's best friend, who Marion Martin, who makes really beautiful moccasins. So um, yeah, that was kind of my experiences growing up. So as I grew older, I began to have a lot of questions. And sort of the best place that I found answers was in university during my undergraduate degree. So I did a bachelor's in anthropology. At the time when I did it, they didn't have um, like a full specialization or anything in Indigenous studies. So I just did a minor and took most of the cross-listed courses that were offered with Indigenous topics. Um, that I started to find a lot, a lot of interest, and that sort of led me on the degree towards what I ended up doing with a master's in anthropology again from the University of Toronto, and I finished my dissertation and PhD at the University of Toronto. Um, From there, I went to work as a curator at a national museum for about 7 years. And then after a really bad car accident, I decided to come back home. And so now I'm at the University of Waterloo. And I've been doing community-based work since about 2016. So what I really want to share with everyone today, because I understand this is a circle where we discuss pathways to healing and things through cultural connections. And so I'm going to share my personal journey through what it looks like to become a good community member, researcher, and facilitator for supporting community, all while kind of situating and learning about myself, where I belong, and where I can use my strengths and my privileges to help uplift others in my community. So the three things I'm going to focus on are how tangible knowledges bring us in conversation with the past and the future. Then how collections, like museum and archival collections, can be used to continue this dialogue with the past and the future. And then a recentering of this dialogue through community-based practice, as opposed to sort of through anthropological extraction or research that is on Indigenous communities rather than with and for. So I'm going to start with the work that I did for my doctoral dissertation. And this explored how tangible knowledges bring us into conversation with the past and future generations. And by tangible, I mean material or physical items. So I'm referring to things that we make, artistic practices, and sort of necessities. So let's talk a little bit about this two paths idea. It's a Haudenosaunee agreement. Degni deohage gaswandage dehondadon serondagua. Also more familiarly known as the Churo Wampum or covenant chain. So for my thesis, I wanted to explore baskets, splint baskets. So Haudenosaunee, we typically use ash wood and sweetgrass. I came into this because I did a project for one of my graduate classes on material culture, and I just kind of fell in love with baskets. So I could see that there were really two different ways discussions were happening surrounding baskets, and I really wanted to explore this deeper. So academics and scholars were discussing one thing, while basket weavers were discussing something totally different. So this is where this two-row approach comes in. And for those who aren't familiar with the two-row, it's an agreement that was first formed around 1613 between the Haudenosaunee and Dutch traders near modern-day New York State, which is the ancestral homelands of the Haudenosaunee. Dutch traders understood that relationship building was essential for their survival and success in a new environment, so they engaged in the diplomatic customs of the host nation, which was the Haudenosaunee they were in contact with. So the two purple lines in this wampum represent the Dutch ship, one of them, and the other, the Mohawk or the Haudenosaunee canoe. I only say Mohawk because Mohawk were on the eastern version, but it's an agreement with the Haudenosaunee.
I think your slides aren't sharing. Sorry
No,
about that.
it's good. It's
Oh, it's
cool.
good.
It's not.
Oh,
You
good.
can't see
Sorry.
them at all.
No, they're not showing. Yeah, not on
Is it
our
no
end.
longer shared?
No, I don't know. Yeah, they're not coming up.
Oh,
Just
okay,
when
hold
you
on one
reference
second.
the womp womp.
Let's get back in
There,
there. Okay, is it
I think it's
sharing
there.
again? Oh, okay,
Yeah, it's
okay.
yes.
Sorry.
Sorry about
Thank you for
that.
letting me know.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if
Um,
you were still kind of talking a dialogue at the beginning or yeah. So sorry about that. I would have
no, it's okay.
reacted a little
Thanks for
sooner.
letting me know. I had no idea. Okay,
Yeah,
back
I
to that. So,
thank you so much.
yeah, the two purple lines here, one represents the Haudenosaunee or the indigenous canoe, and the other one represents the settler ship. So this is a commitment or a relationship for both sides to respect each other's distinctiveness, to not interfere with one another or impose beliefs on the other group. And it also agrees that, no one should be extracting from the other's vessel. So we're moving down the river that is life together in parallel lines, but they're not crossing, they're not interfering, they're agreeing to cooperate and to live peacefully together. So I use this kind of as a framework to explore the differences between academic approaches and research-based approaches to Haudenosaunee baskets, as well as community-based approaches. Um, so I got two very different focuses. So the academic or the research-based focus was focused on three primary things. So origins, the development and evolution, and as baskets and the designs on them as being reactionary. So kind of taking out any kind of autonomy that would come with that. So I'll just explain these three things in a little more depth. So the three theories, of the three theories, academic methodologies have contributed to the anthropological and ethnological study of Haudenosaunee baskets. The narrative surrounding origins has been the most prevalent. One second, my dog is going crazy. I'm so sorry. He's like running laps in the background. Okay. The most prevalent is by Ted Brasser. He worked for the Canadian Museum of History, which was, I think, the Museum of Man or different. It's gone through several name changes. He was a curator in 1975, and he suggested that Swedish colonists introduced splint baskets to Indigenous people in the lower Delaware Valley around 1700 AD because he observed similarities in the baskets produced of German and Swedish immigrants in the Delaware Valley. Another academic, Frank Porter, supported and built upon this observation in arguing that weaving with wood splints came from outside knowledge because there's no evidence that reveals the common production of wood splint baskets or what forms or uses they may have had prior to contact. So fiber arts don't tend to preserve very well in the archaeological record, but there is evidence of plated wood splint corn sifters found in archaeological sites in New York dating between 1650 and 1670. And there's other similar archaeological discoveries, although they're few, but there are missionary observations clearly indicating that weaving and basketry were integral parts of Haudenosaunee life and other nations' lives as well at the time or prior to contact. So the next sort of key focus was on development and evolution of the craft of weaving baskets. So this theory focuses on the evolution and development of weaving, and the hypothesis is that the technique came with horticulture from the south to the north. Academic Lamb argue and Lismer, they each argue that if we accept the northward migration of the Iroquois language family from the south, we can assume that splint baskets followed the same route. The theory is based on similarities of materials and techniques for weaving. And others support this hypothesis and further argue that basketry diffused alongside horticulture in a northward movement through women specifically because they were responsible for horticulture. Haudenosaunee oral histories describe our interactions with other Indigenous nations over a wide range. All across Turtle Island. And innovation and borrowing are present in all cultures worldwide. So none of this is incredibly revealing. So it's an interesting theory, but it doesn't really serve any other purpose other than to reinforce ideas that the origin of wood splint or splint basket weaving is external to Haudenosaunee people, or that it came from settlers not sharing with other Indigenous nations. So this kind of ignores weaving in all other forms as well. Like the techniques for weaving were present long before people arrived here from other continents. And with vast trade networks and kinship networks, Indigenous peoples, as we all know, we're doing these things, trading ideas, trading knowledges, sharing long before settlement happened. A really wise bulrush weaver once told me that all weaving is related, and so I like to keep that in mind when I think about this. I really don't see much in these these origin focused theories or these development and this consistent need for previous academic research. I don't think that's the way things are now, but previously, the earlier 1900s and mid was focused a lot on explaining where things came from, and it was always explaining how things came from somewhere else, not from us. So the third major theory that these academic discussions had focused on was advancement, adoption from the wood split baskets were adopted from Europeans because they believed they could only have been produced in a tourist driven market economy, which was an alien concept to Haudenosaunee people, but it was not. We know that it was not. Um, you know, market economies were something that we were always familiar with, all Indigenous nations. So this is not something that really holds up either. But the argument states that the adaptation of basket weaving technology and decoration reflects a loss of identity within Indigenous communities, because they say there's ample evidence to support normalized and healthy relationships between many nations in North America, including a vast trade network that span the continent. But these arguments define and situate authentic Haudenosaunee peoples in a remote past, subsequently denying our authenticity as Haudenosaunee people today. Some scholars have argued strongly against this theory, supporting that baskets and weaving have a real and important meaning within Haudenosaunee communities. They support Haudenosaunee agency in actively participating in a wage-based economy, which we know is very true, and argue that baskets, like other Indigenous crafts and arts, can be interpreted as being conscious reactions to changing socio-political systems brought on by increasing colonial violence. And there's a lot of issues that they remain with this. You know, when Indigenous peoples identify items they would like repatriated, museums will rely on academic methodologies and interpretations for knowledge acquisition in determining whether items can qualify for repatriation, under their policies. And these policies typically define repatriatable items as those belonging to ongoing sacred ceremonial practices, ancestral practices, or items associated with burials. I think these things are expanding now, but the point I'm trying to make is that these heavy focuses on, you know, external development, external origins, and things that were sort of a research and academic based focus tend to inform how museums view our collections, how they deal with them today and continue to deal with them, and how they continue to be defined. So when I was looking through, how Haudenosaunee people described our art, our basketry, the focus was completely different. There was no focus on origins. There was no focus on, you know, those kinds of developmental things, and there was no focus on, you know, pleasing external markets. So I turned to community. I spoke with basket makers. I wove some baskets. I read publications written by community members, distributed through local community centers and tribal museums, sat with baskets in collections, attended community events that centered baskets, and watched videos made by community members. In these sources, they told a very, very different story, of weaving. And baskets are just one part of that story. So what I came to learn, and the sort of things I focused on here, were cultural knowledge, intergenerational connections, and preservation. So the Haudenosaunee relationship with the environment and more than human kin, as well as cultural stories and important teachings, are often reflected in the weaves of fancy baskets or certain baskets. So a lot of these carry important cultural teachings, which I'll go through in the next few slides. The Gajiskayanondo, or shell weave, is said to remind Haudenosaunee of our relationship with the water and all of creatures that inhabit the waters, for example. Also acknowledges the special use of shells like wampum. So we'll see that in a second. Stories woven into baskets, the basket designs facilitate this cross-generational communication, I came to understand. So when we engage in the work of gathering, harvesting, processing, and weaving, we engage in the actions of our ancestors. We engage in the cycle of creating and claim our place in our communities and nations. And information gained through Indigenous knowledges explains these connections and acknowledges our relationship to the environment and our more than human kin. Preservation was another theme that I noticed was very prevalent. So black ash trees are our primary source. They're being attacked by the emerald ash borer, which is an invasive species of beetle, and the future of black ash weaving is, under threat. Haudenosaunee basket makers are more concerned with preserving the tradition, along with the knowledge and stories embedded within the weaves of generations of baskets, than they are about discussions of origins and evolution. Um, so this information I found is what collecting and exhibiting institutions are most interested in exhibiting items. But this information isn't prioritized equally with information gained from academic methodologies when it comes to questions of ownership and access. So that's something that I'm hoping to write more about in the future. Maybe try and inspire some changes in different directions. So I said I would give you some more information on how these baskets are having transgenerational conversations. So I'm going to tell you what I've learned through the different weaves. So the Haudenosaunee relationship with the environment, as I had said, is often reflected in these weaves. Strawberry baskets, for example, Nyohundesa, they're designed to represent the strawberry or berries in general, most often colored in red, pink, blue, or white. To the Haudenosaunee, strawberries hold a particular importance in our ceremonial life. They're the first fruit to ripen in the spring, and they're a reminder of Sky Woman who brought strawberries with her when she fell to Earth. So it's for this reason that they're considered one of the Haudenosaunee life supporters, and when they're ripe, it signals a time for ceremony to give thanks to Creator. Strawberries are also a medicine plant, and the basket can become a symbol of the strawberry as medicine. In some cases, these baskets may hold medicines or even be given as medicine themselves. Strawberry baskets are also made to acknowledge respect for various elements of creation and the natural world. Yeah. So we also have the gagonsa, or faces, thistle or bird's beak. It's a type of weave that's said to remind the current generation of their responsibility to the forthcoming generations, or those faces coming faces. Serves as a reminder to carefully consider one's actions and decisions and how they will affect those coming. The gagonsa can also be interpreted as a kernel of corn, which is an important symbol to Haudenosaunee people. Corn, we are corn people. So it's something that we also place a lot of cultural importance on. So yeah, the Ganyon Warode, or thistle weave, symbolizes Haudenosaunee governance. There are many pointed issues of contention that can divide people, but when sitting with a good mind and taking the time that's required, there can be a peaceful solution. The pointed shape of the weave is representative of pointed or difficult issues. So the Ganyon Warode is also a metaphor for growing and learning. So in its youth, when it's sharp and prickly, the tendency is to avoid it. However, when the plant matures, it releases its soft seeds into the fertile ground. So the Ganyon Warode plant is also mentioned in the Peacemaker's speech to the Confederacy about the Great Tree of Peace, as reflected in the following statement. I name the tree of the great long leaves. Under the shade of this tree of a great peace, we shall spread the soft white feathery down of the globe thistle as seats for you, where all nations were directed to sit beneath the tree of peace and acknowledge that we were a confederacy of peace. And then we have the Gadis Anido. So it means shell. And the shell weave is a special type of weave, as I talked a little bit about earlier, meant to remind us of our relationship with the water and all the creatures that inhabit the waters. The shell weave also acknowledges special use of shells such as wampum, which have served as symbols of important relationships between Indigenous people and other nations, and Indigenous nations, for commemorating alliances and agreements throughout history. And lastly, I found that the sky dome is present in a lot of different weaves as well. This is a common visual concept in Haudenosaunee culture. It represents a key aspect of Haudenosaunee belief and reveals a great deal of information about the way Haudenosaunee people conceptualize and socially organize the world, from the origin story to the ways in which Haudenosaunee people can live in harmony with the surrounding environment. Celestial, geographical, and mythical phenomena are represented by the design units within the sky dome. So the sun and the horn trimmings, or the celestial or ever-growing tree, or the great white pine. Yeah, so I found that these decorative elements that are included in these baskets are stories. And when I was doing a lot of my research, I listened to, or watched a video, and I can't remember the exact name of the person who was giving this story, but she said she was teaching a group of people to weave baskets. And while she was teaching, she was singing a song. Um, and people started to say, like, what's happening? Like, why aren't you telling us what we're doing? Like, shouldn't you be telling us, instructing us? And she said, no, the basket is the song made physical. So like I thought that was really beautiful, and it's true. And so I think we can have these transgenerational conversations. Part of what I argued in my dissertation was that our ancestors left us these stories in these forms of baskets and in these forms of other material culture or other tangible items for us to remember these stories, to jump off points and things. And then for us now, our job is to push these forward for future generations. So, yeah, these were kind of like the main things through my dissertation. That academic conversations were having much different conversation than Haudenosaunee people were having about baskets and about the importance. Um, so, yeah, academics were really focused on hypotheses of origins, why, how, development and evolution, which they're explaining as reactions to colonial economy or external influence. They do agree eventually that there is meaning, but they don't really get into that. Where that comes in is when we go into community and when we figure out, when we have discussions with people and sit with basket weavers and weave baskets, that this is intergenerational knowledge transmission. We're communicating across generations with this. These baskets will still be here when we're not, and baskets that people before us are here when they're not. So in that way, we're going through generations with these kind of things. So there's our important stories, important teachings are in these items, and preservation is absolutely paramount. It is decolonization. It is everything, because if this is gone, then we have to find a new way to communicate with future generations. So this was kind of the focus of my dissertation. So from here, I want to talk about some work that I did after my dissertation that is ongoing. So it's how can we continue to use collections in this way? How can we continue to speak with ancestors and in return try and have discussions with future generations through collections? I love beading. I've had my work exhibited in two exhibits now, which was really, really amazing. For one, I was part of an artist residency in Six Nations community, hosted by a grassroots organization called Protect the Tract, with whom I do a lot of partnership work. And the other, I did have some exhibit at the Woodland Cultural Center. So I wanted to be able to do work that focused on things that I love doing, also with the things that I love learning. So I love beading, I love crafting, I love making moccasins, gloves, sewing regalia, but I also really love learning about history through things that other people made. So as I was a curator with the National Museum that I was working at, I met a couple of people from my community. So Gashroni is a Gayogono or Cayuga word. One of my project partners, Taylor Gibson, named the project this. It means to make something. So we figured we were going to be making something. But we're also looking at things other people made too. So we started this project, myself, Taylor Gibson, and Rick Hill. born out of conversations that was had at the Deo Hahage Indigenous Knowledge Center at Six Nations Polytechnic. Um, when I was working at the museum, I was really interested in this collection, and Rick and Taylor came to visit, and they were looking at the same collection, but they were looking at the archival part. So I was looking at all the material culture, and they came in to look at the stories and the archives, and we kind of said, "Hey, we're working on the same thing, so maybe we should keep working together." So it involved into a project surrounding the whole collection, which is a very big collection. And we applied to Canada Council of the Arts for a grant to compile and recontextualize this information for rematriation into our community in accessible and respectful ways. So we were recognizing, we're starting with stories. There are 157 stories, and I'll get to that, but we're recognizing that we have to also adapt to be able to appeal to today's youth and hopefully youth of the future. So that's part of what we're working on with getting this collection into community. So this is our team. So Rick Hill is Tuscarora. He's a historian, has done a lot of groundbreaking work with museums and with Haudenosaunee material culture, as well as intellectual and historical. He is our project chair. Taylor Gibson is Geokono. He's a historian working at Dale Hahage at Six Nations Polytechnic. Kevin White is Mohawk. Ganyonge Haga working at the University of Toronto. Tanis Hill is Mohawk working at Polytechnic Dale Hahage as well, Six Nations. Kira Brandt Bierkopf, Mohawk, working at York University from Tyendinaga community. She's a director, and then myself. This is our Gasroni project team. We all kind of have interests in bringing the past into the present, and then subsequently helping that move to the future. So we all understood that there was a lot of valuable information contained in this collection, but that not one of us could do it on our own because we're all approaching this from different angles and different specialties. For example, mine is the physical or material culture. Kira was working on educational development and curriculum. Taylor is really focused with archives. So we all have different areas that we bring strengths to. So part of this project was translating, the biggest part was to translate some of the 157 stories back into our 6 languages, which we have started doing. So we've identified and cataloged the stories. There are some stories that I'll touch on later that are already in languages that we're going to bring back into different languages and kind of get a lot of that working. But our primary goal was the stories. Translating those back into the languages. We've done some audio recordings. We want to animate some of the stories so that we can kind of get youth interested. We're hoping to do some podcasts, looking at interviews, short videos, things like that. We've done some hide tanning work and some videos around that. We've done some workshops. We have a website, which I'll show you in a little bit. And we hosted gatherings of storytellers where we met with people and we discussed the stories, and then we've done some collections indexing. So I'll explain these things in a little bit more detail. The collection itself is comprised of 554 items of material culture. There's 55 field notebooks written by a man named Frederick Waugh, who he collected between 1911 and 1924. There's 250 images where people are named, which is amazing. And then 157 stories. So the collections were made between Six Nations, Oneida on the Thames, Kahnawake, Tonawanda, and Onondaga, New York. So I'll just show you kind of what we've got here. So it's just a brief kind of overview. So in these notebooks, they talk about, for example, these storytelling customs. So a man named John Echo, one of our community members, shared some of this information with the collector. So one of the customs is to start a story saying "akayayage," which is "Geikono" or "Kayuga," and listeners would reply "Hihe." We don't do this anymore, but it's something we want to bring back. Um, and so, yeah, the storyteller, when they were finishing the story, said, "Wak gaekde." You have to excuse my Gekono pronunciation. I'm working more in Ganyangeha. And if the story is too long, the teller would say, "We'll tie this story up with bark, or we'll tie it up and we'll maybe reopen it later." And so we have examples of language in here. There is, they said this in Moha here, so it's akgayadge. So they have it in a couple different languages. So storytelling customs kind of continued here. We have another person, John Jameson Jr. He kind of said that 10 years ago or so, people used to meet together. So he was speaking in 1915. So he was talking about 1905. People used to go because they didn't, have TVs. So they went to other people's houses and everyone kind of sit down and tell stories, which is really amazing. And they would get someone that was really good at telling stories and they would kind of like pass around a hat. So there would be arrangements to meet at people's houses for different evenings for amusement. So what we've done with these stories is aside from translation, we've held 4 storytellers circles in the summer of 2022 where we discussed specific sets of stories each time. And this was open to anyone who wanted to come, where we identified key themes in the stories, discussed the audience and use for the stories, and then identified pathways forward for reintegration through education and curriculum. So we've done a lot of work with a couple of them. So the first one, we've done an audio recording, and the video is being animated by Tuscarora animator Will and Wilson. So the script is created, and there's some images here about the voice acting that we did, and it was all done in Ganyangeha or Mohawk language. The goal is to do it in all 6. So the next recording of the animation will be done in Gekono, I think, and then we'll kind of go from there. But so then we'll have an animated story, little video that children can watch or youths in the languages that connects to the story from over 100 years ago. And some of our project team has created some curriculum bundles around one of the other stories. He particularly sort of targeted STEM because there's, he was trying to move a little bit outside of the arts, social sciences box. So he did some math and some like sort of lower grades level things with some stories about dogs. That was really great. So there's a lot of language in this collection as well. So most of it is Cayuga, Gekono, and Onondaga, but there's Mohawk, Seneca, Oneida, and Tuscarora. And we have some stories recorded in the languages. Some were in English and some were recorded in other languages. So future work, we've started with the English ones, but future work is going to identify like this next one, which is recorded in the language in Oneida by Anthony Day. This one we need to have translated back out and into different languages. So we can use our, this translation in Oneida to kind of go from Oneida to Mohawk. So it's helping our community translators also learn to translate between languages where possible. It's a very difficult thing to do because your brain just has to completely shift. But yeah, so there's so much potential here. So here's an example of kind of the multiple languages that are in there. So we have Skatne Wadariha or Utgwe Daiha or Uske Daiha in Mohawk, Onondaga, and Cayuga. So it means hot or cooked belly, applied usually to the youngest of the family, still presently understood that way, who sits closest to the fire. So part of what we have going on now is a language student is pulling all the language out of all the 55 notebooks. And once this is finished, we're going to arrange some talking circles with language speakers of varying degrees who are going to get a copy of all the words that are included in there. And then we're just going to sit together and have a conversation about how the language has changed over the past 100 years. What's the same? What's different? And we'll kind of just let it flow from there. my sort of method of operations is to just let things be what they're going to be. So I try not to drive, I try not to come into anthropology and drive things because I find that, that skews results. So whatever people are going to get from, reading this language is what they're going to share, and that's what's going to need to be shared. Is kind of how I'm approaching it, if that makes sense. Um, so other things we have in the collection, game customs. So these are really cool. We have, so it says, do wasde sage, do wasde sage, I think. And they're talking about wrestling. So there's words here to talk about wrestling. Knuckle underhand may also be dug into the back. They squeeze hard. The object is to throw the rival by back-breaking hold. They talk about these different things. One hand grasping over the other wrist behind the rival's back, and the object is to throw the other person out of the circle. Sometimes sent him flying quite a distance, it says. And then it also says each can grasp each other by the biceps. So then we have more language here. Jayan wisakwa, or ode nia dize ni saste. They're twisting. It's going to be really interesting to see what language speakers say about these things. Yeah, so we have more examples of games that are in the collection here. The hook and crotch game. We have a double ball game, stick and hoop, and pole game. One of our goals, hopefully, eventually, is to have these games brought back into public schools. So we have the Tree School on Six Nations, and it's kind of like a Waldorf style learning, and this would be like an amazing thing. We want to kind of find a way to bring these games back and reintroduce them, and then at the same time, so we're taking these things from the past and bringing them to the youth, and then letting them take that discussion forward too. So there's also things about oral traditions contained in there. So David Jack, he talks about how the Onondagas traveled from Jersey City to the Grand River. So a traveling that some people had done. And they said, some women are coming. He said, yes. So they gave him a bundle of dirt or soil for the women and some meat for the men. And they gave them this so they could see what the soil was like to signify that there's lots of game. So they were saying, oh, you're on your way. Well, we have lots of things here to provide. Like, it's a good place. There's great soil for growing. We have lots of game. So it's interesting to learn these things, because when we learn these things interpreted through anthropological writings about us, they don't often include things like this. Or if they do, it's kind of reinterpreted through a different lens that is not our own, which I'm going to get to in a couple minutes. So more customs that they discuss in here. To rap twice with a stick. If you rap twice in the door with a stick, it means someone's coming. They're going to come back. I guess there was a custom at one time to anoint a visitor's head with bear grease if they were welcome. So for bows for little boys, they said a woman had to make them according to the old custom, to make them in the right size, out of saplings. And then for sort of a game, I think, to place a marker far away and then have runners run around it and come back. And this is interesting. Pointing at a rainbow will make you crooked. And it's going to be cool to talk to people about these things too, to see if they remember or what they think about it. Because I don't know what 100 years ago they mean by crooked. And then more the photographs. So we have things with this person, John Jameson, nephew of John Paulus, who was an Onondaga man. The collector Waugh spoke with him a lot, so he shared a lot of knowledge and a lot of information, a lot of really important things. And so, along with his knowledge in the notebooks, there's detailed diagrams and processes of how he created these things or how they were remembered. We've got lots of pictures of him using bows in different ways and making them, pair of snowshoes, some other sorts of implements. So there's a lot of things. All these things are associated with him. So when we go back to look at him as a person, where there's a rich amount of information, and hopefully his descendants can, when we find them, get a lot out of this. Here's some more things that he shared. Some hide tanning, and we've done some hide tanning workshops, and we're going to actually be continuing to do some more because it's something that's been identified as a need in our community. So there's a very simple cradle board here, a walking stick. You can see him spearfishing in the Grand River here. And then also these are just two little awls for making holes bigger, poking holes and making them bigger. And then we have another man, John Echo. He shared a lot of information around one of our midwinter ceremonies. So he's got a paddle here for stirring ashes. It's said that this one is decorated by pencil designs on both sides. One side with clan animal and the image of a blue wolf is underlined in a blue line. So paddles are used for stirring the ashes, and the feathers is said to have been worn by one of the ash stirrers or throwers. They used to go house to house to do this. I think in some communities they might. In my longhouse, we do this in the longhouse. But the associated text, he explains how the ceremony was done in 1912. And so it's really interesting to read that and see what's different, what's the same. And then we have some other things here. A rounded bread paddle, shared by a man named Peter John. A model sugar mold for maple sugar. You put the sugar into it and you put it together and it makes a mold. Two eating sticks, a comb made of wood, and two cornbread packages. And then we have here Chief Thomas Smoke. He's Cayuga and his daughter Amy. And so it's really great that we have images of these people with their names so we know who they are. So part of what we're going to do with this collection is print out the photos and leave them at Woodland Cultural Center and at Polytechnic so people can look at them, see if they recognize anybody, add information to them. And at some point, hopefully our website will be up soon. There will be space on that for people to add to the discussion as well. So this is just some screenshots of our website in progress. So we hope to have these things recontextualized through community sort of backup on the website. Images, all the images of the collections will make associations with the people, with the things that they shared and the information, and kind of sort of go from there while also having discussions with contemporary community members. So for example, if we bring in a bunch of stuff about baskets and about the woman who was making baskets and weaving cornhusk rugs, we can talk to current weavers and have them engage with that and see what they say. So it's all about sort of this recentering community in the dialogue. So that's my my third thing that I wanted to talk about, these transgenerational conversations. So when I applied to work at the University of Waterloo, it was the position was for someone to apply to a Canada Research Chair. So that's had been approved. I just had to go through the application process and put forth a project that met the criteria. And I was really thrilled when my project was approved. So I wanted to grow what we're doing through Gashroni. So our team is doing such great work with these stories, but there's so much more in that collection. So the project team has funding to work with the stories. And as I've just kind of recapped, there's a lot more in there that we want to keep working with. So I wanted to expand this to include more community engagement with the tangible or the material culture, because that's what my work is best done with. So I wanted to see how things have changed and stayed the same. And I wanted to hear what people thought about their respective specialties. So I'd read about these things in books and archives, but I felt like we really needed to dig deeper because these discussions are always so focused on origins, like we learned from the baskets. We need to dig deeper into these discussions. We need to get away from this ideas of authenticity or imagined importances of academia that didn't really exist in our communities and bring this discussion back to us. So I was teaching about the history of collecting Indigenous cultures in North America. It's one of the courses that I teach. Um, and I was also teaching Indigenous histories in Canada, which I kind of outline the government of Canada's treatment and lack of continuing and ongoing relationships with Indigenous peoples through a framework of genocide. Um, and I recognize that, I kept coming back again to this ideology of authenticity in everything. So, who, the government defines us as through legislation, who the Indian Act tells us we're supposed to be, um, and how we need to do things based on some imagined ideas of this preconceived, unspoiled, perfect past that, is really romanticized. And I recognize the counterpart to this ideology of authenticity, which I'm calling the ideology of expertise. Um, so I'm currently writing a book about this through this Canada Research Chair, where I'm interrogating this concept of the expert in Indigenous studies specifically, because I recognize that there are expertises that are valid in other disciplines. But when we look at Indigenous studies and community-based work more specifically, and the history of how that has come to be, we see that there's been a lot of extraction and there's been a lot of non-community members who've positioned themselves as experts. Best example I can give is there's people that study Haudenosaunee people that call themselves Iroquoianists, and Taylor and I always laugh about this because they're experts on us, but their narratives have been used to continue to inform how the government interacts with us, for example. And it's not the truth. It's not, and it's narratives that they introduced too. My example comes to mind is William Fenton, who was a scholar who made the Iroquoianists essentially. He came to study us from his own PhD program. He brought this idea of factionalism with him. But factionalism, as it is a very normal part in every government. There are several different options to choose from. But he painted our community at Six Nations as a heavily factionalized community that can't get along with itself. And in doing so, the government still looks at us that way and patronizingly treats us that way. So I don't like this idea of an expert on us. And so I wanted to move past that. So my Canada Research Chair, Dandewa de Nigoraganyo, or We Will Put Our Minds Together, is focused on expanding the work being done with Gashroni to regenerate and reintegrate cultural practices found in museums and archives that have been lost or fractured through community-based methodologies. So in the next couple slides, I'll show you how that looks. But I'm focused on elements contained in the collection, so hide tanning, silver work, basket weaving, things like that, where we can take these discussions to community members currently engaged in those practices and let them speak about what they find most important. We can show them the archival materials, give them a chance to reflect, and then lead a workshop or community discussion surrounding the practice. So in focusing this or decentering this idea of experts and recentering community, I was really inspired and led by this quote by Jake Thomas Gangha. So he said, and this is one of his most famous quotes, I think, there's no experts in Iroquois culture. When we come together, we say that we put our minds on the table. That way, if you have knowledge that I can use, I can borrow it. And if I have knowledge you can use, you can borrow it. We always have something to learn. So this is kind of what's grounding my moving forward. And decentering the expert and recentering community. So here's some of the work that I've done through this. This is a beaded map of the Haldimand Tract. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's an area roughly 950,000 acres of land, comprising 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from its mouth in Port Maitland to its source in Dundalk in what is now Ontario. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy has a long-standing relationship with these lands. As a matter of, there are beaver hunting grounds and have been acknowledged as such for hundreds of years. So the Confederacy was promised this land as a result of the decimation of our homelands in New York State through the Sullivan-Clinton genocidal campaign that kind of razed all our villages and destroyed everything. That was from the newly formed United States. Of this originally promised 950,000 acres, 48,000 remain in as the reserve, Six Nations. So we hosted a week-long culture camp, which was we found a little kind of like hotel Airbnb type thing where there were rooms next to each other, and we rented a bunch of them, and we invited community members, whoever wanted to come. So it was a series of gatherings that focused on fishing and environmental connections, art practices, cultural competency, and corn-based culture. So it took place at the mouth of the Grand River in Port Maitland, and discussions included our connections to that spot, because it's no longer part of the reserve, but it's still part of our territory, a very important part. So the location, excuse me, that location was chosen with the hopes of running a similar camp at the source in Dundalk in the near future. And it was purposely to help community members reform relationships with these important parts of our territory. So we focused our discussions on subsistence activities associated with the river, such as fishing, our environmental prophecies, and the overall health of our people in connection to the environment and the river. We supplied each participant with a basic fishing setup that they could take home with them, with a rod, tackle, and filleting knives. And we brought in a community member to teach everyone how how to set up their rods, how to use the tackle, live bait, how to troubleshoot basic issues while fishing. And then we finished off the weekend with a fish fry and a potluck in the local conservation area, which we had to pay to gain access to. But one battle at a time, I guess. So a key component of this gathering was to ensure people left with everything they needed to continue what they learned on their own. So we provided everything to set people up to begin fishing. And we set them up with tents, air mattresses, sleeping bags, so they could continue to camp and enjoy being on and experiencing a closeness to the land outside of just the reserve. One of the central aspects of this land-based learning camp was to reestablish and strengthen our relationships with the land. So it's ongoing, and we needed to make sure everyone had what they needed when they left, because we found that, it's great to deliver cultural workshops and things like that, but if people don't have what they need to continue doing it, then they won't continue doing it. The image here is a beaded representation of the Haldeman Tract, and this is one of the art pieces I worked on with a couple of other artists as a residency for Protect the Tract. So it's done in the Tuscarora raised beadwork style, Haudenosaunee raised beadwork, and it was a really amazing experience. So I was really, really happy to have been able to contribute to that. And yeah, we did this is the hide tanning that we did. So when we're deciding what kinds of programming to deliver, we survey the community to find out what kinds of teachings people are looking for. So we ask what's needed, what do people want to learn, what are people struggling to access. And so we sent out a poll through our project partner, Protect the Tract, and people said they really wanted to learn hide tanning. So there's a lot going on around this now. We had hunters donate 6 hides with the heads attached so we could learn the process of brain tanning. And so an important part of this, the primary goal wasn't to gather data for research or thinking about research output. The goal was more to ensure community members had access to cultural teachings and activities to build overall community competency. So data gathering and research output were something that was like not central. They were like to the side, because I don't think that, while there are spaces to approach research in ways where you're focused on data gathering, I think the relationship aspect of it and building things and looking at what is needed and what is wanted is more important and will give better, more community directed results than something that's kind of scripted and dictated. We did another really amazing day of cooking in clay pots. So we took traditional clay pots and corn, our white corn. We husked the corn, we processed it, and we cooked We lied it, which was really interesting. We went through this whole process, and then we cooked it on a fire in these clay pots. So we cooked some venison, we cooked some cornbread. Yeah, and we made some soup. Like, it was really great, and it was just a really wonderful day to just have people there cooking together, discussing the different ingredients. Like, we it was a really great day. And part of this was we engaged with language discussions through this too. It really kind of brought out words for certain things. How do we talk about these things? And so it was a great cultural connection, but also an avenue for healing. So we're, learning these things in pieces from, left from the past. And now we're going to do our best to be able to know this and do it again, and pass this on to make sure that it's still around. And part of this was there's a lot of workshops you can do to learn how to do things, but they don't necessarily always come with the full process. So we were going to cook corn, and we're going to learn how to do things, to cook corn, to husk corn, to harvest it, and everything that we needed. But part of that is the material culture associated, which is baskets. So we made gathering baskets, pack baskets to harvest the corn, and we made sifting baskets, which in the previous slide, they don't have one here, to help process and lye the corn. So just kind of looking at important parts of what's needed to make sure these things can continue so they can be passed on. Yeah, so all this work centers on things that are found in the collections and that are discussed within the archival, within the notebooks, but they're also led by what the community wants to engage with. So my first kind of thought about this was I really wanted to pursue, baskets, but people really wanted hide tanning, and people really wanted stories, and people really wanted, so we go with that, like where people are really interested in learning things, and we can always build from there, because when we went with that, we did come around to getting baskets eventually. So it's, it all comes kind of full circle that way. So we've begun interviews and engagement to do some more hide tanning, because people are still really interested in this, and we have a lot of hides. We have a lot of deer. So it's something that we're looking to do some further work with. And we're thinking about getting 3 or 4 hide tanners together instead of just one, so that, everyone can look at the different processes and things like that. But then it becomes, again, more of a community centered approach. And it takes away that we don't have to compete with each other, we can all be good at this. We can all have these strengths, and we can share this knowledge. And we can hold each other up. We're not fighting, we're not fighting against each other for these opportunities. So yeah, I began this journey by coming to understand how we can have conversations with our ancestors in the coming phases through our tangible and physical culture. I looked at the stories woven into flint baskets and found that Haudenosaunee people were weaving stories in the past, were weaving stories to us into their work, telling us about what was important and giving us ways to connect with the most important stories we have. This makes sense to me because one of our foundational teachings is to think of the coming faces. So those generations that are going to come after we're gone. So we have responsibilities to them. And part of my responsibility is to make sure they can still have access to the things our ancestors left us. And that's a tricky thing, navigating museums and the collections. And it still is, and things are changing, but it's tricky. So like the ancestors that wove those stories into the baskets, how will we be good ancestors and weave stories for future generations? So engaging with the knowledge our ancestors left in collections is an important part of being good future ancestors, because we can't let these collections sit and gather dust. Our ancestors left a lot for us, and we have to fight to make sure we can interpret it through our own lenses, our own community ways, not anthropological or historical methodologies. That's already been done, for most of it. It's been done. So we need to take this back. Through our own Indigenous ways of knowing and understanding the world. And one of the ways that we can do this is by seeking the value in what our ancestors shared with past researchers. So we don't need to necessarily consider the researchers' opinions as more than that. that's what they are, respectfully, but they don't need to be upheld as experts on us. Instead, we can create what these things mean for us now, just as our ancestors did then. And by doing so, we can leave stories for future generations to do the same for their future generations. And that's how I think we can become good ancestors. All right. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. That was amazing. I loved hearing just how you kind of started with like your ancestors and how it kind of slowly got into like present day and how to become a good ancestor. And it's so cool just like to think of it like that, like because I feel like sometimes we forget that we will be an ancestor one day, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I really liked it. And just even seeing like the baskets and like the stories and a lot of the origins, and then also like yeah, just everything was like so cool. Like I was so captivated. We have quite a few questions here though, so I should jump into them. The first question is, how do you preserve the baskets? Like, how do you keep it moist after each use? Like, and I guess like the longevity of the basket.
Um, there's museum ways to do that, which is, I'm not sure if that's what you're asking. How I preserve like baskets that I use in my house, we just use them, you know. We take baskets to Longhouse whenever we go for a ceremony, and they become used. So, you know, they'll eventually decay and their life cycle will go. But in museums, they preserve them by climate controlling. So I think they keep them like in a fairly specific, like fairly dry environment. When I was working with collections, they were quite brittle. I don't know that I don't think that they're moistened at all at that point. I think ones that we use for personal use become moistened through use. If that makes any sense. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, in the collections, they're quite dry. They're quite brittle.
Okay, good to know. And then our next question is, this person said they love these baskets and the cultural lessons. Are you collecting this into your book and your website, or is it kind of another project?
Yep, this will go into the book, and it will be on the website as well. We're hoping to put as much as we can on the website. We're kind of figuring out exactly what it's going to look like based on the collections. I think there's must be negotiations for access because we don't technically own them. But that aside, we do own our intellectual property. So we can share what is appropriate to be shared. And yeah, a lot of these things I've pulled together from different resources that were available a lot through the Native North American Traveling College in Akwesasne, and other spaces that come with published that are already published. So I can also share those if anyone's interested in like a resource list.
Yeah, yeah, I think that'd be great. And for like some of these baskets, like because you guys for some of the like the teachings and stuff you received from the journals and pictures and stuff, like are some of the community members or knowledge keepers in your area able to kind of just see the basket and be like, oh, I totally forgot, like they've almost like unlocked something in their brain and then they're like, I remember how to do that, or like have you had any of those like aha moments with any of the
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, definitely. Um, Mostly in museum context collections, when people would come to visit things, look at how they were made and things like that, I think it really sparks a lot of emotion for one, because there's that really strong connection that people kind of floods you. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of instances. I don't have like anyone in specific that I can name, but where people would come in and kind of like be interacting with something. A lot of artists go in to look at specific pieces, and look at how someone has made them and say, oh, I can see what they did here. Oh, I can see what they did here. That's how you do that. Okay, I remember, or things like that. I think it sparks a lot of different memory. With the baskets, a lot of, so it's hard to access these actual material items. So mostly what we're working with is the images.
Hmm.
So we have a little bit of a limited capacity there. Most of these things are in Ottawa, and we're six and a
Hmm.
half hours away, 6 hours away. So
Yeah.
to get, we've to get everybody there is very difficult. So we would like to have things. I mean, my end goal is to have it all come back, but we'll see where I get.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Our next question is, where do you believe that rematriation practices are the most progressive and worth advocating for inclusive in other locations? I think it's repatriation. Is it
No rematriation.
repatriation? Yeah.
Um, I just want to ask for clarification. So, do you mean examples of rematriation in other settings, like other people's work?
I think so. I think
Okay.
I think other
Um,
community like outside of
yeah.
yours.
So, Robin Gray, I think, is at University of Toronto, Mississauga. They have done some really interesting repatriation of songs back to their community on the Northwest Coast. I don't remember exactly which community it is. Um, but they found a bunch of songs in a collection, and they went and had discussions with the community about them and kind of brought those back through the proper family line. Another really interesting thing was the Beskotu or Passamaquoddy people in New Brunswick and Maine. I forget exactly which collection this was in, but they found a bunch of wax cylinders that had old songs on them. And they brought them to the schools, and the kids sing them again now. So
Mhm.
they kind of brought that back that way. And yeah, that's kind of what it comes off the top of my head. It's sort of like rematriation is kind of being still being defined in sort of opposition to repatriation. Like repatriation is like the very like legalistic Western framework. The you have to have things by very specific criteria. Um, Things have to be sacred, ceremonial, or associated with grave goods or ancestral remains. And outside of that, the definition for sacred and ceremonial, we all know is different for each community. Like that's just an umbrella term to
Yeah.
say that something has meaning that is beyond what they can explain. And the final arbiter is whether you're looking at the states and you have legal law like NAGPRA, or whether you're looking at Canada and you have recommendations based on good ethics and good faith. The
Mhm.
final arbiter in the end, the decision maker is always the institution. It's never us. So repatriation itself is just a legal process by which we can try to use settler or legal definitions, Western definitions and methods to try to get things back. And rematriation sort of comes in opposition to that, to say it's like restoring of a right relationship.
Mhm.
But it operates through our own ways and our own methods. It doesn't subscribe to these legalistic terms and Western frameworks. So the best way that I could kind of talk about how that works in my experience is we have to use what we have, and we have digital. So we're bringing this back as best we can into physical spaces from a digital reality, if that makes sense. So we're limited, but it's what we have, it's what we can do. So maybe as things move forward, things we might be able to bring things back, but I think it's more associated with, in my understanding, um, ideas, knowledges, things like that. It would be great to have the physical pieces, but it's more the stories and the things that come with them that we're pulling back with rematriation.
And then our next question is, for language recordings or materials in museums or other non-Indigenous institutions, how can these be accessed by nations who are gathering for their language and cultural materials and resources?
Um, we've had really great success with the American Philosophical Society. usually if you want to access language or recordings of any kind, you can go to the archive or the museum's website and try to do a base search of their collections. Not all of them have really good, robust online databases. So you can email the archive or the museum or the curator and ask for a list. So you would ask for, if I wanted Ganyangeha, I would say, can you give me anything, a list of what you have recordings in the Mohawk language? And then they should get back to you with that. Um, I've had recent struggles with museums denying access and just not responding and kind of just being really evasive in my requests for language resources and working with students in our language immersion program and trying to get some stories and some language audio for them. And we've had a lot of roadblocks. So, but there are other places that are not quite as hostile. So I think the best thing to start is to either email or look on the website of the specific place and ask what if they have anything, and they should be able to send you a list.
Mhm. And um, so my question is, like for your community, you kind of mentioned that you had like a cultural camp. Like what sort of things within the camp were people most like excited for on paper, like when before going, and then like afterwards realizing, wow, this one was actually more impactful to me. Or was it kind of
People
a
were really, yeah, they were really excited. So we have Haudenosaunee have some prophecies about climate,
mm,
surrounding kind of like where things are going, where they're going to go, where we're at.
mm,
And a lot of our discussion framed around that because we were specifically kind of targeting environment relationships with that. So I think prior to the camp, people were really looking forward to that. But it was also a very kind of distressing topic as well because we're facing so much change and so much uncertainty. Um, and I think I did a couple of presentations, one again about baskets, and I went a little deeper than I did here to include older ones with different symbols. And I think people had a really great response to that because we looked at prior to the really fancy weaves that I showed everyone today, they used to block stamp or paint things onto baskets, um, similar kinds of motifs. And one of the things I was always wondering was what their purpose was. Like, what are they talking about with these? So I went and looking at what the symbols were. Were they associated with spring? Were they associated with what kind of plants? Is it the sun? Is it people? And out of those discussions came some really great information. Like someone just said, maybe that's what was stored in it. That was the seeds of that plant or something. So the the people really enjoyed those discussions and looking into those things too. I think the material culture tends to always get people really excited.
mhm. Yeah, I know for my community, we've been doing kind of we do our oral history, which is kind of we call it chapteeth during I think it's like the first snowfall. I can't actually remember though. And then it's once the snow's gone or like when spring's here, we stop. But we've been doing the stories at the beginning, and then after the story, we'd everyone who's tuned in because it's on Zoom now because we all can't meet as a community as well. We kind of go into the similar discussions of what's your interpretation of this story and what are your meanings? And a lot of our knowledge keepers and elders have told us like every time you hear a story, um, even at different ages, you'll get different teachings from it, and it's interesting that like it's cool to hear that other communities are doing that too, like even with like their baskets and other you were mentioning with the weather and whatnot, and so it's cool to hear that. um,
Yeah, yeah, I love that about stories and trying to like understand them in that way that like when the storytellers are telling you, they're not telling you what to think. You take the story at the point that you're in life and kind of use it then, and then yeah, at another point in life, the story might mean something totally different to you because you come through a different part of it, and I love that about them.
yeah,
Great.
it's really great. I love it. And then I think just I guess like one last question. For like what's you kind of mentioned like you work kind of got started in this through school. What is your driver now for continuing to do this work? And yeah.
Love. I love my community. I love the history. I love the people I'm working with, even if they don't always love me all the time. um, like it's just all of it, you know. I did start out as like a journey of self-discovery and um, it can be hard, you know, to come back to a community when you have been disconnected, but I have found so much love and so much accepting that it's just like it fills me
Mhm.
up, you know. And like there's always going to be a struggle with that for people, whether you've grown up in your community, I think, or not. So it is the love for, you know, what our ancestors shared, and you know that responsibility that we have to take that forward, and all the love that's been shown to me through everyone who's been so kind to, you know, welcome me and to bring me into things and include me and, you know, make a space for me. And so yeah, that's it. It's love.
Well, that was our last question. I really appreciate you sharing everything that you did with your presentation and also just sharing like your why and whatnot. And yeah, did you have any closing remarks before we end the webinar?
I just thank everybody, Neil, Goa, for listening. It was wonderful. If anyone wants to has questions or wants to get in touch with me, my email, I can put that in the chat. Um, yeah, yeah, I'm reachable, and yeah, thank you. Just thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. I kind of
Well,
struggled to put this together because I was like, what should I talk about and how should I talk about it? So, um, but I was happy with where it went.
one last question. Your earrings, where can we get your bead work?
Um,
Do you do
okay,
the
you have to add me
website?
on Instagram. Um, yeah, I have to click the accept for the ad, but if anyone's local, I'll be, um, there's a market on Saturday and Sunday, at the Gathering Place from Six Nations, and I'll have some there.
Great. Sorry, we um accidentally posted in the hosts and panels chat, but we got it to everyone now.
Okay.
Yeah, great. Okay. Thank you so much, Talena, and thank you for everyone for joining in. It was so great to learn about how intangible and tangible materials and things have made like an impact for not only us here today, but our ancestors and also our future generations and just how much stories are embedded in within that and healing and how we by continuing to do this work, it'll not only help us with our own healing journey, but future generations, you know? So thank you. And just before we end this webinar, we'd love to bring our attention to our webinars coming up in the new year. We have Red River Jigging, that's on January 14th. And then we have Indigenous Health Administration Leadership Program information session on January 16th. And all of our webinars are free to sign up for on our website at www.learningcircle.ubc.ca. And thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing everyone at our next Learning Circle. Lim Lim, thank you.